Recollection, and today we have Father Cyril. Pinchak, Jesuit by ritual. I think he needs no introduction. You all know who he is, so we're so happy to have him here to talk to us.
Thank you, thank you. I feel like I need to say thank you, Mrs. Ritz, because she was my ECF teacher for Sunday school back in the day. So thank you so much. Thanks to all of you here at the parish for the kind invitation to do this Lenten reflection. So the theme of this talk is to talk about emerging from the tombs, recommitting ourselves to community, to faith, and to service. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about what is it that keeps us in the tomb? What is it that keeps us stuck inside of those tombs in our life? And then what is it that will help free us from those areas? You should have a sheet in front of you. I'm just going to those are my notes. You're welcome to keep it. You can follow it along. You can point out the things I skipped or forgot. It's for you to keep and share. So I'll begin with a poem by an American poet named Mary Oliver. And it's a beautiful poem that I first encountered when I was in college, actually, at John Carroll. And it goes like this. It's called The Uses of Sorrow. And it's one evening she dreamed this poem. And she says, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to realize that this too was a gift." It took me years to realize this too was a gift. So let's talk about those moments of darkness. Because in a tomb, it's kind of like a box full of darkness. And it's precisely there where Christ enters. And he enters into my life and your life, and into those areas in our life where we become isolated and alone, where we feel cut off. That's really what it means when we say that Christ entered the tombs, is that he entered into the deepest, lowest points of our life and into our world, into those boxes full of darkness that we come across every once in a while in our life, and he turns them into a gift. That's what we recognize as the gift of the resurrection, that it's only by passing through the tomb that we're able to enter into new life. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is buried. And here's how it is, the 27th chapter. It says, "When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was himself a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered for it to be handed over. Taking the body, Joseph wrapped it in clean linen and laid it in his new tomb that he had hewn in the rock. Then he rolled a huge stone across the entrance of the tomb and departed. But Mary Magdalene and the other Mary remained sitting there, facing the tomb." See, these women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, were just staring at a rock. Perhaps you've had those experiences in your life. Perhaps you're experiencing one right now, where you're just staring at a rock, unable to imagine the miracle that God is working behind that rock. Mary and the other Mary just sat there, overwhelmed, unable to make sense of it all. As we'll hear in the Gospel of Luke, Luke and Clopas are on the way to Emmaus, and they said, "We were hoping that Jesus would have been the one to save us and redeem us. That we just can't even imagine all of our hopes and dreams being dashed, what God could do with it." All these women could see is that cold finality of death, of loss, of shame. The one that they were hoping for would really redeem them, failed, put to death on a cross, overwhelmed. They sat in that shame, in their confusion, and they couldn't understand the miracle that was happening behind that stone. I did a lot of confessions the last few days with St. Ignatius boys. Believe it or not, some of those boys in high school are sinners. Only a few. I only heard 70 or 80 of them over the last couple of days. But I found myself kind of repeating a few things. And one of them was talking to them a bit about how evil works in our life. And I want to share those with you. I think there are three main ways that evil works in our life. The first is through shame. The second is through deception, whether that's self-deception or deceiving others. And the third is through distraction. Believe it or not, for high school boys, I think distraction is probably one of the strongest ones. But for you and for me, I think it might be one of those first two, shame or deception. Shame is the idea that nobody could love me if they really knew. God would never be able to enter into this area of my life. It's the idea that I'm not contributing enough. I'm not holy enough. I'm not good enough. That if God really knew who I was, he wouldn't love me. If people really knew who I was, they wouldn't love me. God could never forgive me for that. It's lies also about our self-worth, about being made in the image and likeness of God. Lies that say, I've done something so terrible, I'm probably not even a human anymore. That your sin's so great, you're not worthy of love. And sometimes we enter into that shame, into that darkness, and we can get stuck there. I was hearing a confession from a young man who gave a really good confession. He went point by point through all the things. He was rigid and determined to root out every area of sin in his life. And I said to him at the end of it, it's a good confession. You really brought a lot of yourself to this. You were humble and honest. You were real. Thanks for your risk and your trust. But I said, you know you're good? He said, yeah. I said, really? And he said, no. And that's what shame does. It tells us that we're not good when we really are good. And that's how we know that it's from the devil. Because it's a kind of deception. Shame leads to deception. The devil, all he does is lie. Lie, 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 lie. That's all the devil does. It says, you're not good enough. You don't have any worth. And deception then, when we believe that deception from the devil, we start lying to other people and lying to ourselves. We start saying, oh, well, you know, it's not that big of a deal in my life. I don't really need to ask for anybody's help. I don't need to bring it to somebody for advice. I don't need to trust it to my confessor or to my spiritual father or mother. We can also say, well, I know it's not really a good thing, but I'm doing it for the right reasons. Or we start to lie to ourselves by self-justifying, saying, you know, it could be worse things that I'm doing, at least I'm only doing this. Sometimes we even say, well, at least I'm not as bad as so-and-so is. And so we fall into that second trap of evil, which is deception. We start to lie to others. We start to say, well, you know, I really want to make myself somehow different than I actually am. That if they knew me, they wouldn't love me, they wouldn't support me. And we go further, deeper into that darkness, into that tomb. And that last one is distraction. So we have shame, deception, and distraction. Distraction where we just get so busy with things, we keep telling ourselves that this is so important, that we forget what really matters, and that's love. It's a distraction where we say, where would I even begin if I wanted to be good? Well, let me just stay here for a little while and just watch another Netflix episode. Let me just sit on my phone and scroll through some social media for a little while longer. John Chrysostom has a great story about this distraction, about feeling overwhelmed. He tells the story about a young man who was sent by his father to go prepare a field for planting. And the young man goes and he looks at the field and he sees how many are the rocks and there's weeds everywhere, and he just gets overwhelmed. So he takes a nap. He wakes up later, and by now it's too late to really begin, so eventually he goes home. He comes again the second day, he looks again, how many are the rocks and how great are the weeds, the thistles, the brambles everywhere. He gets overwhelmed, and he takes a nap again. And finally, the third day, he sees again how many are the rocks and the weeds, becomes overwhelmed and takes a nap, and his father comes to see how it's going. And he wakes the son up and he says, son, what's happened? What are you doing? And the son says, Father, I know you sent me here to prepare the field for planting, but I saw how many were the rocks and how great were the weeds, and I just became overwhelmed and I went to sleep. And the father looks at him and loves him and says, son, if you would have just prepared the little area you need to lay down each day, by now the field would be finished. And so it is with us. We say, oh, just one more of these little distractions, just one more thing, let me just rest here a little while longer, and it keeps us from doing the good that we need to do. A lot of times I think it's because there's areas of pain and hurt in our life, and we want to grow numb to those. And in growing numb to those areas, we distract ourselves from real life, authentic life. it's time now to emerge from this tomb. It's time to emerge from that area where we feel overwhelmed, where we feel full of shame, where we feel distracted, where we're lying to ourselves. As you know, COVID has been quite a change for people. It's led to a lot of distraction. It's maybe even led to a lot of deception and shame. But it's time for us to recommit ourselves to three things, I think. To recommit ourselves to community, to recommit ourselves to our faith, and to recommit ourselves in service to others. The interesting thing about having a stone rolled away from the tomb, to having that shame and that distraction and that deception removed from our lives, is actually that Jesus didn't need to remove the stone in order to be resurrected. Jesus was able to walk through walls, remember? Although the doors were locked, we sing in our tropar, Jesus entered in the upper room. That he didn't need to go move the stone out of the way to emerge from the tomb. But yet he did. The reason why he removed the stone, the reason why the stone was rolled back, was not for Jesus to get out, but for the women to look in and to see the miracle that had happened. And so it's the same with you and for me. It's time for us to remove the stone that gets in the way of us seeing the miracle that happens every day. The miracle that's God's love, God's resurrecting love. The same love that raised Jesus from the dead raises you and me. And that's what we celebrate. Because we often think that life is somehow lived on this side of the tomb, but not on the other side of the tomb. On this side of the stone, we somehow have freedom and joy and peace. And when we're inside the tomb in those areas of shame and deception and distraction, there's no life. But in fact, it's precisely in those areas where Jesus reached and went into and brought life even into those. But you can't stay in the tomb. You can't just remain in deception and distraction and shame. Christ assures us that life is brought even into those areas. Last week I talked in that homily about the fig leaf, how Jesus comes into those areas of shame and says, Nathanael, I saw you underneath that fig tree. I saw you in those areas of shame, and I entered, and I loved you, and I called you. And that's what Jesus says to you and to me. In the moments of the tomb, he calls us out of the tomb. It's not that we emerge out of the tombs by ourselves, it's that Jesus calls us out. You look at the iconography and you see Adam and Eve being grabbed by the wrist. When you take somebody's pulse, you take it on their wrist. You grab them and it says, life is now. I can feel it coursing through their veins again. And Jesus in the icon grabs Adam and grabs Eve, each by the wrist, and hauls them up out of death, out of the tombs, and brings them to new life. Life is actually the experience of being hauled up out of death, out of shame, out of distraction, out of deception by Christ. And that's what it is. It's not simply staring at the stone. That's not life. When we sit there and we stare at the stone, that's when we experience death, really. When we allow Christ to enter into those dark parts of our lives, that's when we experience life. When we emerge from the tombs, called forth from the tombs, that's where life comes from. And so, ironically, the tomb is actually a gift. This past year and years has been a gift, if you've been able to see it. Because a lot of people, for years and years, would go out into the desert, those early desert fathers and mothers, and they would try to eliminate from their lives all the distractions, to cut things out of their life. 2020 and 2021 cut a lot of things out of our life. And it helped us to see, where are we? What do we really care about? And sometimes those things we care about are not actually God. Sometimes those things are we're resentful and frustrated we can't go to the movies, or go to a restaurant, or that we really care about the fact that we want to see people's faces and smile and communicate with them. By having those things limited, we actually see what we value and what's of God and what's not of God. And so the tomb is actually a gift. The tomb, an experience of feeling distant from God, is actually a gift, and it's hard to understand that. But it's called desolation. And I want to say that there's three reasons why desolation happens in our lives. St. Ignatius of Loyola, I'm a Jesuit, says there's three main reasons why we experience desolation. The first one, he says, is because we're lazy or tepid in our prayer. And so it's a way for God to kind of urge us back to prayer, back to going to divine liturgy, going to Mass, go into the sacraments, and to say, if God feels distant, maybe it's a chance for you to look to say, have I been distracted in prayer? Have I been lazy? Have I let my prayer routine fall out? And this is a way for God to kind of urge us back, something of the shepherd's crook, pulling us back onto the right path. The second reason is not because we're lazy in our prayer, but perhaps to challenge us. Now, he was a soldier and he thought about battles, and he realized, as many of you have, competition actually brings something of the best out of us. When we have a challenge, something emerges from us that we never knew we were capable of. And so God allows us to experience something of a challenge in our life, so that way we can say, wow, God, with your help, I didn't know I was capable of overcoming that challenge, that difficulty. And so in fact, the experience of that dryness, that desolation, when it's hard to feel hopeful and faithful and loving, that those are actually experiences that draw us closer to God, because you say, God, I can't do anything without your help. I need your help. And God will reach in and give us what we need. And the third reason, besides because we're lazy and tepid in our prayer, or perhaps because God is challenging us, the third reason he says is because we feel entitled. He has this beautiful phrase. He says, we try to build a nest in a thing not ours. We're like birds and we say, this is my tree. I own and deserve this consolation, this experience of God's love. I've achieved it. I've worked for it. But you haven't. It's just a gift. It's always a gift. As soon as we start to feel entitled, that we deserve God's love, then no wonder we lose it, because we can't hold it as a gift anymore. It's not love then. We all need more love than we deserve. If we deserved it, it'd just be a paycheck, right? But it's love. And that's what God gives us. So those experiences of dryness, of desolation, those box full of darknesses are in fact a gift. They're a gift because they help us to recognize, I need to recommit myself to prayer. I need to redouble my efforts in fasting and almsgiving this Lent. Because it's an opportunity for me to say, hey, when we all pull together, when I do my part, it's amazing what God draws out of me. And perhaps because I feel a little entitled, that I forget that actually this whole thing is a gift. When you look around and you see all the people here and you think of the people in your life, it's amazing because it's a love that exists, but it doesn't have to. And yet God makes it exist. And we get hurt and we get frustrated when we feel something is attacking that love. And you know who feels that same way? Jesus. He wept over the death of his friend Lazarus. He was outraged at sin. And he overwhelmed death through his own death. Just to show us that love is stronger than any of these things. So Ignatius says, when people are in desolation and they come to you, you're supposed to do two things. One is to leave them feeling like they've got some self-worth. Leave them feeling hopeful. And to help them on their way. So I have an activity that I want you to think about. Because it's time to come out of the tombs. It's time to find beauty in your life again. It's time to find hope. It's time to emerge out of the shame, out of the self-deception, and out of the distraction in your life. And I want you to find some beauty in your life. I want you to find some love again. Because that's what happens in the darkness of that tomb, is that God's love enters into there and helps raise Christ up. In Romans 6:3 it says, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we've been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. That Jesus shows us the path. He shows us the way in which to walk on it, by going there himself. He enters into those tombs and experiences it himself, not because he deserves it, not because he's ashamed, not because he deceives himself, not because he's distracted ever from the Father's will, but to enter into those areas of our life. And he brings life into them, and he brings love into them. So what is this newness of life that we hear about in Romans? That we might walk in newness of life. What I'd like to propose is that it's not a new life. You don't need to change your life and be like, oh, well, all of a sudden, I've got to go be a Jesuit because Father Cyril's a Jesuit. They don't have to. That would be a new life. God calls you to newness of life. In Revelation it says, "Behold, I make all things new." Jesus, the Son of Man, will say at the end of time, it's not that he's making new things, but he's making all things new. And so in your life, it's a time of renewal. Lent, Easter, this whole dynamic is a time of renewal, of newness of life. That you're actually pretty good. You're pretty darn good. And God loves you. So recommit to what's good in life. The newness of life comes not in totally throwing out everything, but in recommitting to what you do already. Recommit to community. You're already part of a community. You don't need to go finding one. You're already here. So recommit to it, especially in a challenging time that this parish is experiencing right now. Recommit to community. Move away from the shame that cuts you off. Move away from anger and frustration. Jesus experienced shame and confusion on the cross. You and I are experiencing that shame and confusion right now. That means we're experiencing something with Christ. It becomes no longer an isolating thing, but a place where we draw even closer to Christ. What we want is not the cross. We don't ask for the cross, but what we want is we want love and intimacy with Christ that will go anywhere, even if it means going to the cross. That's the source of our community, the source of our Eucharist, the source of this body of Christ is being close to Christ. And that means taking up our cross every day and following him. Recommit yourself to faith. Don't believe the lies that Satan tells you about yourself or about other people. Don't believe that everything is destroyed and the world is broken and will never be redeemed or restored. That's a lie. Don't believe that this church is dying. Jesus says the church will never die. Don't believe any of those lies. Have faith. Have faith. Be courageous. Be strong and stout-hearted. So recommit yourself to faith. Because faith says ultimately, do I really believe that God can enter and bring love even into the darkest areas of my life? That's ultimately what faith is about. Is can life come out of sin and darkness? And the answer is yes. It's stronger than sin and darkness and death. That's what we say. Love is stronger than these. That's what our faith is really about. And finally, recommit yourself to service. The only way you're going to find meaning in life is actually, paradoxically, by losing it. By giving something of yourself up more than you thought you could possibly give. Because if you hold on to anything, then you're still not giving entirely yourself to God. And God will never be satisfied until he has all of us, entirely. Even those parts you think God might not want. Especially those parts you don't want to turn over to God. Recommit yourself to service, to giving of yourself generously. Serve a church and a work. It's only in that self-gift that life can emerge from the tombs. Lots of other people were put in tombs and buried and died and stayed dead. But Jesus rose, and you and I rise because of love. Because the Father's love lifted Jesus up out of the tomb, and he's promised that where he's gone first, you and I will also go as well. That same love that raised Jesus from the dead will raise you and me. It's just up to us to accept it. And we don't have to wait until we die to start living empowered by that love. That's what service is each and every day, lay down your life in self-sacrificial love, and you'll actually live. Anything else is not really life. In Matthew, we hear, he who finds his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. That's what it means to live a life of service. So I want to lead you through a final little prayer activity. This will take just 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that. Because I think it's important to walk through an experience of being loved. If we really want to emerge from the tombs, and if it's love that allows us to do it, it means that same dynamic is going to have to happen in our lives right now, today, in this experience. I've been talking to my students, again, some of those confessions, and saying, I feel sometimes we're kind of like lizards. You know how a lizard's got to sit in the sun for a long time and let the sun come down on the lizard for a long time, hours sometimes, until it gets up enough energy, right? They're cold-blooded, so they're not able to what's the word? To regulate their metabolism and their energy, right? So they need to just soak up that warmth from the sun. And then once that lizard has got enough warmth from the sun, then he can go do whatever he needs to do in his little lizard life, right? No matter how challenging the path is ahead, he's soaked up enough sun, he's got his energy up, he's able to now go and do that. And so it is, I think, with you and with me. Before we can do these difficult goods in our lives, these challenging things of emerging from the tombs, of sharing and working synergistically with God to bring about the good things in our life, to escape the chains of shame, the chains of deception, the chains of distraction. We can't do that on our own, because you can only white-knuckle it so long. Be like, oh, I'm going to get this figured out in my life. I'm going to manage this. And then eventually your willpower is exhausted, and you fall back into those same self-deceptions, those less than noble distractions and self-soothing methods. If we want to really be free, we can't rely on our own energy and our own power. We have to rely on God's grace and love. Because once you've been filled with love, then it's easy to do the right thing. You don't even have to think about it. You just respond automatically, because by its very nature, love wants to respond in love. When you are loved a lot, the only appropriate response is to love in return. So I wanted to take a few moments to just think about how it is that you're loved. To just soak in, like a little lizard soaks in the sun, soak in the fact that you are loved and lovable. Because out of that love, God will then reach in and grab you by the wrist and pull you up out of the darkness of the tomb into newness of life. So here's the activity. You can close your eyes, you can keep them open. You want to sit comfortably, but not too comfortably, so we don't want you to fall asleep. I know this is getting long. We're almost at the end. And I want you to just first begin by breathing. I know, sometimes it feels as if we forget to breathe, but you are breathing. You are a human being. No fancy breath, no in through your nose, out through your mouth, whatever you want, just breathe. And recognize that each and every breath is in fact a gift from God. A little tiny miracle, right now, that you draw in, and a little tiny miracle that goes out into the world. Let all the stress and the anxiety of the day roll off your shoulders. All the things you were supposed to have done but didn't. All the worries and concerns about what the future might hold, let them go and just be present for a moment. What I want you to do is I want you to think of 3 people who love you a lot. A lot, a lot, a lot. More than you deserve. 3 people. Take a moment. I'll give you almost even a minute to think of 3 people. Just think of 3 people who love you a lot. Who are they? You can say their name quietly to yourself. Picture them in your mind. Those 3 people who love you a lot. Once you have those 3 people, what I'd like you to do, you can even write it down on your sheet of paper or something. Think of, for each person, what are a few qualities that they see and love in you? What characteristics, what qualities do you have that they see and love in you? So for each one of those persons, come up with 2 or 3 things that they love about you. and take another 20 seconds or so and just rest in those qualities and characteristics, that list of those things that people love in you. And then to conclude, what we'll do is we'll just say a little prayer in gratitude. We're going to say 3 Our Fathers, actually, one for each of those people. So think of that first person, what they see and love in you. And as you say this prayer together with me, say a prayer of gratitude, thanksgiving, both for them and for the fact that God has poured those gifts into your heart. So think of that first person and say it with me together. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
And now, think of that second person. What a gift they are in your life, and what a gift you are to them. And say with me together.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
And finally, that third person. Take just a moment to rest in the fact that you are loved and lovable, and the deep love and affection you have for this third person in your life. And we say together,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you all for this opportunity to talk. I'm happy to take some questions if you have them at this time. Well, let me just give you some advice then. Do this activity again every day for the rest of your life. And perhaps, it sounds strange, but I did it with the teens, the Byzantines here, and I actually had them write it down, and so I wrote it down too. And you don't need to say who it is or what it is, but just those qualities and characteristics, and maybe stick it on your bathroom mirror, or someplace where you'll see it, in a journal, or where it'll fall open on a page one day and you'll say, hey, these are these things that people see and love in me, where you see it. Because what happens is when you start to recognize what other people see and love in you, then you can start to believe that God sees it and loves it in you. And then, maybe, with a little grace and a little help, you can really start to actually see it and love it in yourself. So when someone asks you, are you good? You can say, yeah. And you say, do you know it? You really are good? You can say, yeah, I do. And it's a beautiful thing, because you are good. You're made in the image and likeness of God, and he said that the sun is good, and the moon and the stars are good, and the sea creatures are good, and the plants and the animals are good, but he said that for you and for me, we're very good. So don't forget that. You are very good. And it's the love that made you very good will never let you be anything less than very good. And it's that same love that makes you for life, not for the darkness of the tombs. So write it down on a sheet. Read it every day. These qualities, these characteristics that others see and love in you, that God sees and loves in you. Because if you can really believe that you see it and love it, then now you have it. And when you have it, you can actually give it away, because you can't give away things you don't have. But when you realize the love that you have, you can now give it away. Thanks. Question in the back, yes.
I have a question. For everybody here, if you could explain, what are the, in practical sense, first signs of deception?
In practical terms, what are some of the first signs of deception? That's a great question. I'd have to think about it for a little bit, but I would say some of the first signs of deception in our lives, when we start deceiving others and deceiving ourselves, are often I think also connected sometimes with shame, right? A lot of times shame, right? Adam and Eve, they were deceived by the serpent, but then that deception later came also to them, that they ran away and they hid. And I think it's noticing that as soon as you start deceiving yourself, you start to somehow feel ashamed. And so when I was a novice, a little baby Jesuit, I made one kind of vow to myself, and I would encourage you maybe to consider it somehow in your own life. I've not been great at all the vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, but this one I really try to stay true to, and I encourage you to it. That I said to myself, if it's not a big deal, I'm just going to tell my superior about it, and if it's not a big deal, then he'll say it's not a big deal. Because too often I try to deceive myself and say, oh, this isn't really that important, or, you know, it's not really that big of an issue in my life. But I think that's the first thing that happens with deception, is that we try to convince ourselves that it's not as bad as we think it is. And if it's really not as bad as we think it is, then someone will agree and tell us. So find a trusted friend, find a spiritual father, spiritual mother who can help you to say, it's good you brought this, it's good you're concerned about this, it shows that you care. But you're right, it's not that big of a deal. It's small potatoes in the end of the day. But the problem is those little things, when they get hidden, they don't go away, they just fester and get worse. So I think that's one of the biggest ones, is sort of self-deception, is kind of the shame around not sharing it with somebody that we trust. I think maybe another one around deception is deception always starts with little things. And then it grows and it's bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, and I think a lot of times it's self-justification. I think people actually have better formed consciences than they think. So you can trust your conscience. If it makes you feel a little uncomfortable, it's worth bringing it to confession. It's worth bringing it to the sacrament. And that's one of the most beautiful sacraments. I mean, I just really think it's just such a gift. All the sacraments are, but especially the mystery of repentance, the mystery of reconciliation, confession. It helps free us from these chains that bind us. Other questions?
It'd be interesting, a comment. The three persons that we thought about, to be bold enough to ask those persons what three qualities they especially loved in us.
Yeah. So this was just for the folks who may not have been able to hear. Deacon Bill was saying it could be a good activity to go to those three people and ask them, what qualities do you see in me? To be courageous enough to ask them, to say what good qualities do they see in me. And we ourselves could say, hey, and here's some qualities that I see in you.
It seems like the other qualities, especially if you're married, the arguments start, the others, the qualities they don't like in you, that are most kind of the subjects of those arguments.
It's a comment about how in marriage the other qualities we don't like sometimes can lead to arguments. But it's true, it's important to recognize those qualities that we do really love in each other. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here. I will continue to pray for you the rest of this great Lent, leading into the Easter season. It looks as if I'll be here for Holy Week, praying with you all, so I'm really looking forward to that. Please keep me in your prayers, and let's keep each other in our prayers, that the same God who raised Adam and Eve out of the tombs will raise you and me out of the tombs of our day-to-day shame and deception and distraction, and lead us into the newness of life. So let's stand now. Oh, one more question. Okay, go ahead.
This has nothing necessarily to do with our topic, but why does God allow such evil in the world, such as Putin? To bring that suffering upon all those people in the Ukraine and everything. I just don't understand it.
So the question was, why does God allow evil into the world, folks such as Putin, to bring such evil and suffering in for the people of Ukraine? As I mentioned in the homily, I don't really have an answer, and I don't think anyone actually has an answer about the question of evil. There's a whole branch of theology called theodicy, which is the question, not the Odyssey, theodicy, which is, why does evil exist? How can an all-good and all-loving God allow evil to exist? I've studied it a little bit, and I've been confused. And I think that's actually the point. The scholastics, Thomas Aquinas and other folks, would say that evil is by its very nature not just like wrong, it's illogical. So if you say like 2 + 2 = 5, well, you're wrong. Like you can see the framework, we could actually explain, okay, no, when you put 2 of these together and another 2, you get 4 and not 5. But evil isn't 5. Evil is just literally nonsense. It's somebody screaming their head off. You say 2 + 2 = and they're just screaming. It's like you can't have a conversation. You can't explain it. Because by its very nature, it's outside of reason. It's against reason. Of course, it's reasonable to be loving and to be good. And evil says, I know it's the right thing to do. I know it's going to be for my benefit and for everybody's benefit if I'm good, but yet I still choose evil. And evil is not just outside and Putin and other people, it runs even to our own hearts. And so Christ saves you and me by entering into our hearts, by allowing evil to look as if it's won and overcome. But in fact, it isn't. It's overcome by love. And that's what we have to say, is that the nonsense of evil isn't greater than the orderedness of love. And so I don't really have an answer, other than to say, Jesus entered into it more deeply than any one of you or I could, that he entered into it fully, into the nonsense of evil, and was spat, beaten, crowned with thorns, mocked, experienced the shame and confusion of the cross, suffered at the death of a friend, Lazarus, and cried and wept. He wept over Jerusalem and said, if you could only understand that today salvation was in your midst, if you could only understand that love is here right now. And so that's all I can do, and all you can do, is be in solidarity with people who suffer, to pray for them when nothing else we can do. That's one of the gifts that we have in our church, I think, and maybe I'll finish with this, is we have a beautiful gift of praying for the dead. We pray our All Souls Saturday, especially throughout Lent. And a lot of times we think, okay, well, if a person has a mind, I can pay for their education. If they have a mouth, then I can pay for some food or make some sandwiches myself and feed them. If they're naked and have a back, I can put some clothes on them. But the dead have nothing. And all we can do is pray for them. They have nothing other than our prayers. And there's a lot of situations in our life where people may not be dead, but they're so far away, or the problem is so great and so grand that we literally can do nothing but pray. Maybe in the Ukraine we can send some money like we did in our collection today, but ultimately, even more importantly, what we can do is pray. And I think that's the only response to evil, is to do the good that we can do and pray. One more question.
I saw the news that they sent this woman from Texas through that Goya CEO that's doing a lot of faith, sending a lot of food to Ukraine. This woman, 15,000 rosaries were sent to Ukraine through this woman. And she said what the power of the rosary is so huge. And I thought, what a beautiful woman, one woman, to start something like that, and then more rosaries were sent. 15,000 were sent to Ukraine.
So you're talking about in the news how one woman, through her own effort, was able to send 15,000 rosaries to Ukraine, and then there are more being sent. And just the power of the rosary and the power of prayer. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Okay. Well, please pray for me and know that I'm praying for you. And let's pray for each other.